Hello, friends. This is Dennis, and I'm excited to be here with you today to spend a couple of minutes going over the work of Ernesto Bozzano, more specifically, one of his books, maybe two. We'll talk a little bit about that, and have a chance to see how it connects with our knowledge of spirituality and spiritism in particular, and how that is impactful to us today. So thank you for taking the time to be with us. We would love to hear where you're connecting from in the comments, and let us know what else you'd like to know about this incredible person, Ernesto Bozzano. But you may have heard about him before, and we'll talk briefly about him. We will not provide a biography of him. You have a chance to see that in our earlier episode on the series with our friend Charles Kemp. But here we go. So I think the great place for us to start here is the book itself. The book we are going to be talking about today is called The Enigmas of Psychometry and on the Phenomena of Telesthesia. And it was first published in Portuguese in this format. This is not available in English, as we are aware as of yet. So if you are struggling to understand Portuguese or perhaps don't understand Italian, we hope that this conversation may provide some insights into the contents of this book and why it's important. So this book and the format that we are talking about today was published by the Brazilian Spiritist Federation, and it connects two different works that Bozzano did in Italian. Gli Enigmi della Psicometria in 1921 and Dei Fenomeni di Telesthesia in 1920. Forgive my Italian there. Don't mean to butcher that beautiful language. But in this format, what we see here is this great work of Bozzano encompassing these two different smaller works. And I think it's really great because, as we are going to see here, we are going to argue that psychometry and telesthesia are really connected and they're complementary in many different ways. So it makes sense for us to combine these two works as we have a conversation about what is psychometry and what is telesthesia, and see how that may impact our understanding of spirituality, mediumship, and everything in between. All right, so let's just go ahead and talk a little bit about Bozzano so that you have an idea in case you have not had a chance to go into his biography. But Ernesto Bozzano was an Italian philosopher and metaphysicist. He was born in 1862 and passed away in 1943. So he was born right after the publication of the Spirits book and before the publication of the Gospel. And so you can see here that he was born in that moment that we see this great development of spiritual thinking on earth, of spiritism and so forth. And from a tender age, he displayed an interest in science and spirituality. So he really read a lot of the work of Richet and Crookes and was interested in that. He was very familiar with Spiritism, having written to the Spiritist Review. His life is very interesting. But I think at the end of the day, what is really fascinating here is that he served as a bridge between science and spiritualism. And what do I say by that? He really brings us a lot of scientific oomph to a nascent spiritual and spiritualist philosophy at the time, and Spiritism as well, by bringing his precise thinking methods and his ability to catalog and look at different cases and make powerful arguments in defense of this nascent body of work, a body of knowledge that was spirituality at the time. So in that way, if we look at Bozzano in this work, he really has a wonderful role or contribution to give us in the history of spiritual thinking. Why do I say that? Because if you look at a timeline here of what his contribution is in the middle of all this, we see Allan Kardec coming with a spiritist codification, which really took the idea of spiritualism even deeper. Kardec was born in 1805, 1869 he passed away. Then after that, we have Leon Denis that really expands Spiritism into a greater philosophical mode. He's just a wonderful writer, has a really deep philosophical sense to him. If you are familiar with him, it's definitely worth reading his works. And at the same time, we also have Charles Richet, the French thinker who was a metaphysics, metaphysicist, and also received the Nobel Prize for his career and work. So, and along that time, at the same time that these guys are all living together and are fostering spiritual thinking in different ways and in different directions, we have Gabriele Delany and Ernesto Bozzano, both great exponents of scientific spiritualism, bringing us a greater sense of science into the spiritual thinking at the time. And of course, we still continue to do that with modern science and the search for consciousness and all of that. But it's always interesting to place that in the timeline of human knowledge and human growth, so that we have a sense of how important this work was, and Bozzano's work in general was, at the time that he came. Naturally, nowadays, we are almost 100 years removed from the bulk of his work, especially this book, 105 years from when he first started thinking about this. And so there will be many other cases that we might be aware of nowadays, and we might find more interesting because they might be more recent. However, I think it is only fair that we lend credence to his great work and the way that it opened, along with Allan, this idea of conciliating scientific thinking with spirituality. It's really fair that we recognize that and we pay homage to a certain extent to that thinking process as well. And that's what we hope to do here. So, with that context in mind, let's dive in to the work itself. So this work, the Enigmas of Psychometry and the Phenomena of Telesthesia, are really two different parts. The first part, we find him explaining psychometry to us and sharing 26 different documented cases in part 1 of the book that bring his thinking forward. At the end, he adds some comments to us so we can better understand things. But it is really a wonderful opportunity for us to dive into documented cases from different places. And you will find here that he often uses cases from other people. He was not necessarily a researcher of himself, of trying to be a agent in the cases he was studying. He really gathered from different sources, which I think is really powerful. And then on the second part of the book, he really deals with telesthesia. And in here, in part 2, he has 23 documented cases following that same perspective. He begins with introduction, and as he dissects each of these cases, we get to learn a little bit more about the topics at hand. Right? So what we propose to do here is, much the way that he did, is to split our conversation in two, and first to go ahead and talk about the cases of psychometry, and then we are going to dive into the cases of telesthesia and try to figure out how that may tie it all back to our daily living today and what we can learn from that, right? So, as we dive into this idea of psychometry, I think it's important for us to begin to understand how is it that he could define psychometry so that we have a sense. It seems like a very long word, a very sophisticated word, psychometry, right? So it's ability of connecting the psyche at a distance. So what does that really mean? The way that Bozzano defines this is this. Psychometry is the faculty by which a sensitive, somebody that is sensitive to that, has that ability, upon touching an object, perceives images and sensations referring to persons or events that have been in relation with that object. And this is the really fascinating piece here, right? So what we're really talking about is that the object, as he continues to tell us, serves as a point of departure. Right? So you're able to touch an object, like a ring, for instance, and because of that, it can act as a key, opening access to fluidic currents in which are preserved the psychic impressions of beings and events that once vibrated in its proximity. So the idea here, as you might gather, is exactly what you have read, is that through touching an object, those who are sensitive and have this ability are able to establish a connection to the history of the object, the environment around that object, and those people who were around that object, and imprinted on them their emotions and their feelings. So it's a fascinating way of looking at things and understanding that that you can connect with facts in the past or in the present based on your connection with a material object. And that is a fascinating piece as well, because I think the key piece here is for us to understand that in the case of psychometry, the idea is that this information that we are connecting to via an object is not being provided to us by a third party. It's not being provided by a discarnate spirit or another living consciousness. Is that the ability of the sensitive or the medium or the psychometrist themselves to use their own abilities to connect with the vibrations imprinted in an object and then be connected to people and places and environments and so forth. And that is a fascinating piece to this because it really requires no spiritual help to obtain that information. Now, to ascertain that that is possible, that is the trick, right? So Bozzano really goes through 26 different cases trying to show us incidences in which there can be no outside contribution to the knowledge that the sensitives, as he calls them, are able to acquire. So that we can really see that the only explanation for the information gathered is that the sensitive was able to connect with the object and gather that piece of information without any outside assistance. There are 26 different documented cases, and all of them are really fascinating, and some of them are really complex and difficult. So I've just got a couple of them here, 2 or so that you can have perhaps some insight into the kind of cases he was looking into, and perhaps you also feel tempted to read the book itself. It's not a long book, but it is a fascinating book. And so let me share with you one of the cases. This is the cases of the fossil of Mrs. Denton. And so, as I said, Bozzano would gather these cases from different places. He was really good at cataloging them and being able to pull them up. And this particular case, he brought from the magazine Light, as he often did, and other magazines at the time. But it's fascinating in many different ways. So let me tell you briefly about the case, and you can be the judge of that. All right, so this is a case of the fossil of Mrs. Denton, and it's one of the interesting ones because it's one of the earliest and most famous psychometrics experiments that the sensitive and Denton, wife of geologist Will Denton, brought us forward. So the way that it happened, William Denton blindfolded Anne Denton, and in that process gave her an object, a sealed object, which was a sample of a rock inside a package. She had no idea of what the object was or where it came from, which is the fascinating piece about this. And almost immediately after holding it, she began to describe what she perceived, and she used vivid language, and she says, "I see a great forest of ferns and tall trees, a world of strange plants and gigantic reptiles moving slowly in the warm, misty air." She continued describing what seemed like prehistoric world, the colors of the sky, the vegetation, the still atmosphere of ancient earth. And when she finished, her husband unwrapped the object. The object had been wrapped this entire time. It was indeed a fossilized piece of an ancient fern, which was collected from geological strata, a part of the rock, belonging to the same period she had just described. And that is the fascinating piece, because Bozzano highlights this case as a cornerstone example because the object had no identifying features visible to her, even though the object was already wrapped, right? And no one else in the room was thinking of the object's history, eliminating the usual explanations of telepathy or suggestion. So to Bozzano, this demonstrated that the fossil retained a kind of fluidic imprint, a subtle record of the time and environment in which it was formed. And through psychometry, the sensitive's consciousness could momentarily read those impressions and bring them into awareness. And as Bozzano writes, the seer, the sensitive, appeared to transport herself into the epoch when the fossil was formed, describing with calm and familiarity the life of a world long vanished. And I think that is the fascinating piece about this, because Nobody in the room knew what the object was, other than the husband who had brought the object in, and not even he really did know what the object was. It was given to him, and she was then able to transport herself, which means that she could not have gathered the information from the minds of the people that were in the room, because people who were in the room did not know what the object was. Therefore, her impressions must have come from the outside, either through a spiritual influence or through her ability to surmise that from the vibrations present in the object, which she did not see. And so that was the interesting part about these cases. And I think it begs the questions for us about how that happens. And it's a fascinating piece. And that's the depth of many of these cases. And they go in a lot more detail. Bozzano gives us a lot more description here. But there is also another case that I find fascinating. And it's the case of the carrier pigeon. And I think it's a fascinating, really interesting case. In this other striking episode, there was a French sensitive that was given a small, carefully wrapped package containing a few feathers from a homing pigeon. She did not know what it was because it was wrapped, of course. So, he did not know. It was a man in this case, knew nothing of what was inside. And here's what's fascinating: that as soon as he held the package, he began to describe not a static object, but a vivid living experience. He said that he saw birds flying in circles, building with many of them resting inside. He felt that a man was taking care of him with affection and pride. He also then shared the idea of the fluttering of wings, the rush of air, and the feeling of flying, emotions that did not seem human at all. And as he described that, he also shared that he was looking to go back home, and he had this image on his mind of peace and food, and he was climbing high into the air looking for it. And all of a sudden, he sensed that energy in the direction and started to fly towards that. And as he approached, he will become to see familiar scenes from above, a city, towns, and getting closer. And as he got closer to what seemed familiar, he suddenly felt a sharp fear, as though something nearby threatened him. And he then realized that he was really afraid, at least the animal in which he was sensing the vibrations from, was afraid of two cats that were nearby. And so all of a sudden, this fear of a cat being able to get him, and that he must hide and flee. And he was also afraid of being captured by other humans before he did that. But he was able to land and feel free again. And as he described all of this, and the packet was opened, everybody in the room discovered that it contained feathers of a carrion pigeon belonging to a local breeder, and that the bird has indeed been caught by a cat before. And so he was really afraid of being caught by cats and had that fear. And also, many of the breeders in that area would try to steal other people's pigeons, so humans would also capture the pigeons, and that also explained the pigeon's fear of being captured by human as well. And Bozzano was astonished, because to him, this case proved that psychometry could penetrate beyond inanimate matter into the vital and emotional domain of living beings. So it was not just about the emotions of human beings, but also animals. And the feathers, he argued, still carry traces of the animal's vital fluid, preserving the impressions of its fears, its habits, and its affection. So he concluded that the sensitive had entered in resonance with the psychic vibrations of the animal, reproducing the elementary states of consciousness, its fears, its attachments, and that was evidence that psychometry reaches into the domain of life itself. So, as you can see, this is fascinating examples there, because one was from a woman that did not have any knowledge of the sample, the fern, the fossilized fern, or knowledge of the history of the world or of geology, and nobody in the room did either. And the second one was connected to a pigeon who was not a living being, and therefore could not have influenced the communications there. and that later on the facts he described really were confirmed as true. The fear of cats, the fears of humans, and that was indeed a carrier pigeon. And so that was a fascinating piece to show us this idea that indeed there may be possible for us to connect to the energies of the objects or the environment as a whole, and in it read the imprinted emotions, feelings, and facts that happen. As a matter of fact, in the theosophic or ancient traditions, oftentimes we may find reference to something called the Akashic Records, which is this place where everything in history is stored. And Bozzano addresses that in this as well, saying that in fact, I think the universal fluid is the cosmic memory, is the book of life of the spirit. So in different ways, this universal fluid that we know that permeates the entire universe connects us to each other, and in the process keeps our memories, our feelings, our impressions, and it's that we're able to access that. So he explains the Akashic Records a little bit within a Spiritist framework, and I find that fascinating in general. But our time here is short, so we'll move on, because we could spend tons of time sharing with you many different cases for your own insights and experiences. But what's here interesting here then is that he says that every object, every place, every human environment is a living archive of the souls that have passed through it. So everything that is around us is permeated by our feelings, by our ideas. And if we have the ability to tap into that, then we can relive, see, witness, whatever term you may want to describe, the events that took place there. Not only that, we can then establish a connection to the human beings who would then be part of that event. So it's almost sometimes like a very deep connection that we can have to a location and a place. And then in the location and the place, we may then do this double connection to other people who were in that location in the place, and vice versa, kind of like connecting, ping-ponging through different places and accessing all the information that's there, if we have the ability to do that. And I think that is fascinating, isn't it? So we'll pause there. And that was psychometry as he explains it. And then he moves on to the second part of the book, where we're really dealing with telesthesia here. Here, I think you will remember, he has 23 different documented cases in which he dives into. And the trick really becomes, how do we define telesthesia, and which cases do we bring forward to analyze them? Well, he says that telesthesia is the faculty by which the sensitive perceives directly, and here's the key word, without the mediation of an object, scenes or facts that take place at a distance or that belong to the past or to the future, according to the degree of lucidity reached. The future is a key thing in there too, right? So the difference here then is what we see is that in psychometry, he continues, perception occurs through the fluidic emanations impressed upon the object. That is, we're able to connect to facts, people, environments based on energies present in the ring or in the objects. In telesthesia, the spirit itself detaches from matter and perceives in the fluidic medium by its own faculties. So in telesthesia, we are then able to go straight to the specific places and tap into that information without needing a starter object, so to say. So telesthesia, in a way, is the same psychometric ability other than requiring an object for us to start that. And that, I think, is what's fascinating here in this process. So what kind of cases can we bring forward in a short period of time that might be of interest, that perhaps will spark your curiosity so that you can feel compelled to read the book? Well, one of them is about the shipwreck of the Arabella boat. I think it's a fascinating piece. And in this case, we have the narration of some folks, a quiet evening at home, and an English medium all of a sudden falls into a trance and begins to speak with urgency. And she describes what she was seeing before her mental or mediumistic or inner eyes. She says there's a ship at sea, there are heavy waves, there's darkness, the crew's running, calling. The name, she can't see the name, and then she can, it's Arabella. And then she watched as the ship was battered by the storm, the deck splitting and the man falling into the sea, which must have been a horrible experience. But the experience was so vivid that she wept and kept saying, "They're lost, the ship is gone, they're lost, the ship is gone." So the people who were with her wrote it down, and the time was carefully noted when she had these impressions. And a few days later, they learned through newspapers that the very hour a vessel named Arabella had been lost at sea during a violent storm. And remember, this was 100 years ago. We couldn't have immediate verification of what had happened. They learned days later through the newspapers from a faraway place. And Bozzano thinks this was crucial because no one in that group had any knowledge of the ship or the voyage. Thus, telepathy was impossible. Getting information from somebody else's mind that was present at the time was impossible. And there was no object to hold, so she could not use psychometric powers. The perception she has was direct and spontaneous, indicating that it really was a case of telesthesia, the perception of distant realities without material contact. And so it's a fascinating case. There are many different others, and Bozzano writes that it was a direct, independent, and objective vision, a typical case of telesthesia, in which the spirit of the sensitive perceives the facts occurring far from the physical location and without using their normal physical senses. Right? So that's one of the cases that is really fascinating, that shows us that maybe the soul has this ability. Right? A second case here is that of a factory fire that I bring to you. So in this other example, a group of experimenters was conducting a seance in Paris when, without warning, the medium interrupted proceedings, very alarmed, and he cried out, "There's a fire, a great fire, I see it now. Flames are rising from a large building. It's a factory, wood and smoke everywhere." The participants also recorded the time of the vision, and the next morning, the local press reported a massive fire that had broken out in the factory on the outskirts of Paris at precisely the same hour. Again, none of these present had any personal or emotional link to the factory of its workers. There was no object or photograph involved, ruling out the psychometry thesis. And for Bozzano, this was a clear evidence of telesthetic perception, the mind perceiving an event at a distance independent of both telepathy and suggestion. And he went on to explain that the phenomena cannot be reduced to telepathic transmission, since no one there had relation to the place or the people in the event. It was a direct clairvoyant perception, an authentic case of telesthesia. So I think here then you can see that in these two cases, there is also the ability of the sensitive to perceive facts at a distance that they would not normally be able to perceive with their own senses. And that they were able to do so through their own abilities because there did not seem to be an outside source or force like a spirit providing the visions to the sensitive. They were able to discern that with their own ability. Now, whether that's entirely true, it's always up for debate. There's always a possibility that we can say, oh, this was a spirit who had led them there or showed them these images. But it doesn't appear to be the case because no spirit manifested in that seance, for instance, sharing that had taken place. And so what we are faced here then are with two interesting phenomena, psychometry and telesthesia, and we can see how they are very connected. As a matter of fact, when we pause to reflect and read Bozzano's thinking in this, he says to us that telesthesia and psychometry are therefore 2 degrees of the same clairvoyant faculty. In the first, the spirit perceives directly, that's telesthesia. In the second, psychometry, it perceives through the fluidic emanations that are impressed upon objects. So they are very, very similar. In one, right, we have the perception of directly, and the other one we use an object. So how does that relate to us? Well, I think this is where we see how fascinating Bozzano's work is, because it's in complete alignment with Kardec's work as well, and that of others. If we are to connect Bozzano's processes and cases to that we read in Kardec before, we are going to find that what Bozzano calls psychometry, which really are impressions left in the matter, is explored in the Medium's book in items 162 and 3, and also in Genesis chapter 14, item 14 by Kardec. So Kardec also talks about this, and I love to see. I like to see. I really like to see that there is a concordance, there is a convergence of these explorations, the cases that Bozzano shows us and that which Kardec has told us through the help of the spirits. The same is true with telesthesia, which in Spiritism, in the larger body of knowledge that we tend to study as Spiritists, telesthesia really is the emancipation of the soul's ability to go somewhere else outside the physical space of their body and perceive events that are taking place somewhere else without the help of external factors. We also see that in the Spirit's book, questions 402, 3, 425, if you're curious, and the Medium's book, item 172. So you can see that what Bozzano is doing is using slightly different words to describe the same concepts explained in Kardec. And if we dive a little bit deeper to how that takes place, we see that what Bozzano calls the spiritual communication field can be understood as our universal fluid. That is to say, this matter or principle, we should say, it's not really physical as matter, or a lot more subtle and quintessential than our matter, that permeates absolutely everything. And by accessing that, we are then able to feel the emotions that were imprinted in locations, connect to the people who had them, connect to the objects as a whole, and really be able to access this great archive that is there, that everything that ever was and there ever will be in there as well. And so including potentially events in the future. There are some cases where we have precognition, where people are able to tell events that are going to happen in the future. And that is a fascinating case in itself, because it's hard to predict what's going to happen. So the fact that people were able to could be related to the idea, as Bozzano describes, of cause and consequence. And given the connection to one's consciousness and knowing what they have gone in the past, it's understandable to predict what they will have to go into the future. Could be a conversation for another time. It's so fascinating as well, because there are so many items and so many side conversations and side studies we could do from different items in this work because of its depth, because of the ability to solicit different perspectives and go into this incredible realm of mediumship, of clairvoyance, of this ability to perceive outside our physical body. And so I think that one of the things that we can take away then from this, and I think this is what matters, is that every thought, every emotion, and every act leaves an imprint in the universal fluid, a record of the spirit that can one day read, right? So the idea that everything that we do, everything that we are, everything that we think of leaves its mark in the world. And so we ask ourselves, what is it that we are thinking? What is it that we're feeling? And what is it that we're dedicating our time to? Because that leaves an imprint behind. And those questions leave us to reflection and to our own understanding and perception. But they also brings us some practical considerations. If the spirit is able to have this ability to connect and go outside of itself, it's yet another proof that we are more than meets the eye, that we are more than just physical bodies, that we are able to tap into this nature and these abilities that don't seem to be of this world, to realize that we are indeed not of this world only, that we are immortal beings created by God with these abilities that we can develop over time and that connect all of us to each other. And that's a fascinating perspective, one that bears remembering in the day and age that we live in, where oftentimes we are pulled by materialistic perceptions of greed or focus on physical things, because of those things we are told will bring happiness to our lives, when we see that that is not the case. When we know for a fact that it's not the case, because we know that we will leave this physical body and go into a new dimension and then again take on new physical body. So attachment to material things doesn't do us any good. As a matter of fact, many of our studies show this. We see, for instance, a wonderful chapter for those who are interested in that as well in the book, In the Domains of Mediumship or In the Realms of Mediumship, depending on the translation. Chapter 26 about a young lady who is attached to a mirror. And which was given to her by somebody who she loved, had to travel away and never came back. And she held on to that mirror for decades, hoping that that person would come back and fulfill their vow of love. It's a fascinating example. You can read in that chapter, if you want to, the explanations of our guide Aulos to Andrew Lewis and his friend Hilario, and see how that works. But it's another case of psychometry where you can touch that mirror and be able to, through their own ability, perceive the past of that spirit that was still attached to that object and read this entire story and understand that in the future, that loved one that never came back would have to come back and perhaps accept that that suffering spirit as part of their family to make up for the suffering caused there. So interesting perspectives that lend a very practical piece to us, which begs the question, what is it that we are getting attached to? Should we really be worried about physical things? Do we really worry about our car, our house more than we should as immortal spirits? What traces are we leaving behind? What kind of connections do we have? And if we are coming to our spiritual senses, which I think we slowly are, and if you're watching this, you're interested in that, then the question of the moment is, what is it that we're focusing our immortal energies on? And what is it that we take with us? And that is a fascinating perspective for us to keep our eyes on, because after all, what really is important here is for us to be able to connect to our spiritual selves and understand how things work. It's not necessarily to be able to be curiously connected to different objects. That is a nice thing to do, but it's to come into the full presence of our spiritual senses and all these abilities that are in us, that are inherent to us and that we have not tapped yet because we have not yet fully realized our own spiritual nature. And I think that is Bozzano's contribution to the work here. And I think that's why it's so wonderful to go back and read his work and his works in general, and the works of others like Gabriel Delan or Charles Richet, that points us to this idea that there is indeed an alignment between scientific thinking process and philosophical perspectives that show us that we are immortal spirits, continue to evolve and to understand our role in the universe. So I hope that these cases that Bozzano brings, whether they are of psychometry or telesthesia, and how they are connected, really whet your appetite for you to do your own research into your own abilities and the abilities of the spirit, and in the process find some serenity and some wisdom in how to live and understanding that you will transcend the physical body. If you have any questions, please reach out on social media at Dan Assisi, comment on this video. Thank you again for the time and patience that you have shared with us today. And I hope that Bozzano may be added to your reading list in the future. Thanks very much.